Hello. Hopefully you have, by this point, listened to part 1 of the World War II PowerPoint. If not, go back and listen to part 1. We are going to start with American values in wartime. I've broken this up into 2 PowerPoints just so I don't have one huge, gigantic file. And I feel like that makes things a bit easier. We are going to talk about how the wartime experiences raised a lot of questions about American values. And a couple things that are really going to challenge our values, our democratic values, are going to be the internment of the Japanese, the challenges to American civil liberties, like freedom of speech. We've talked about that in World War I, and even in the Civil War. And government secrecy, which we kind of left off with in the last podcast, debates over race and segregation, and of course the decision to drop the atomic bomb. All of these are going to be major questions that are going to lead to controversies during and after the war. So we'll start off with Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans, as you may remember, had been migrating to the United States since the end of the 1800s. And there was a large Japanese community in California. Many of the Japanese Americans living in California had never been to Japan. They were second, third generations of immigrants. They were American citizens. However, there were a few Japanese Americans that were caught in the United States and convicted of spying. And because of this, the United States government and American and white Americans began to heavily distrust the Japanese American citizens. In fact, the entire Japanese American community came under suspicion of being potential spies. As a result of this, FDR issued Executive Order 1066, which rounded up the Japanese American citizens and put them into internment camps. This is still seen as one of the greatest flaws of government activity, of government policy during World War II. Of course, every war that we've talked about so far has had mistakes that were made, and this is one of the biggest mistakes that was made during the 1940s. The Japanese Americans were put into these camps, and I'll show you a couple pictures of them. They were often in desert regions of the United States. There wasn't a lot of privacy. Families had their own living space, but usually were separated by just a curtain, and they didn't have a lot of living space. And here's another picture that I feel like really symbolizes what, just kind of the irony of it all. Now, it is important to understand, these were not concentration camps. We were not systematically killing people. But there is an interesting parallel there in that we have our American citizens behind barbed wire, and we rounded up citizens of a particular race and put them into camps because we saw them as a threat. And there's really no way to explain that or excuse that. In fact, in 1988, the American government issued an apology and compensation to the living survivors of that. So you can definitely see a very, very controversial part of our history. In fact, this came before the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was indeed necessary in wartime to suspend the civil liberties of Japanese Americans, to put them in camps in the interest of national security. So we're kind of following in the tradition of the Schenck versus the United States case, which hopefully you remember from World War I, but suspending our rights during wartime becomes a major theme here. Despite all this, the Nisei Regiment fought, this is a regiment of Japanese American citizens, fought quite valiantly throughout the war in the European theater. And they were citizens who, rather than going to these internment camps where their families and friends were, chose to join the United States military and chose to fight for a government that was at the same time imprisoning their countrymen or their friends and relatives. This is just an example of a what happened to a lot of Japanese American business owners. You can see here, this is a Japanese grocery store, and the grocery store owner put a big sign on the front that said, "I am an American." And essentially what he's trying to do here is get people to come shop, because after Pearl Harbor, a lot of whites didn't want to shop in Japanese businesses. They felt like they were supporting the enemy. And so he's saying to them, you know, I may look different than you. I may look like the Japanese, but I am an American. I am an American citizen. But then you see at the top the big sold sign. And it looks like here either this was sold when he was sent away to one of the internment camps, or beforehand he just couldn't have enough business to stay open. I'm not sure which, but he ended up losing his business. And this is exemplary of a lot of what happened to a lot of Japanese American citizens. They lost their businesses. So even after internment, you know, they came back and their homes had been moved into by whites, their businesses were gone, and they basically had to start life over. So everything they had built up to that point, in many cases, was gone for the Japanese American citizens. So it is a very sad chapter in the United States history, hopefully one that we've learned from. There were some parallels to this shortly after 9/11. People of Middle Eastern and Indian descent who were targeted, or their businesses just were not frequented because they were seen as part of the enemy, and that wasn't the case. But you tend to see this happening when someone that looks different from the majority, when a nation targets the United States. Unfortunately, it's kind of become a reoccurring theme. This is another interesting case. Kind of adding this in just because it shows once again our fear of immigrants, and another mistake that the United States government could have easily avoided. As you remember, 1921 and 1924, the United States government passed a series of immigration laws that put quotas on the people groups coming in from Europe. Well, in the 1930s, a ship departed from Hamburg, Germany. The ship was called the St. Louis, and it was carrying a passenger load full of Jews trying to flee Germany. They knew that events were not going in their favor, and the ship was originally bound for Cuba. However, due to some confusions and a series of events, essentially, Cuba decided to deny the Jewish refugees entry into that country. So the ship turned northward and sailed around the coast of Florida for a few days, trying to gain entry into the United States, trying to bring these Jewish people into the United States. But the U.S. government said no. You know, they need to process their immigration paperwork just like anyone else. We cannot exceed our quota, our immigration quota. And the United States government even put the armed forces on alert on the coast of Cuba. The Coast Guard would fire on this ship if it approached into U.S. waters. So the ship was forced to turn around and go back to Europe with its passenger load of Jewish refugees. Most of them were able to find asylum in Belgium, France, or Great Britain. However, unfortunately, a few years later, Hitler will invade Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, and the passengers who had found asylum in those three countries, many of them will end up being shipped off to concentration camps and dying there. The passengers that got off and were able to find asylum in Britain, their lives will be saved because Germany will never actually invade Britain. But once again, it just shows the consequences of our heavy immigration quotas, our feelings of nationalism, our fear of outsiders during the 20s and 30s, and, you know, lives that were lost that didn't necessarily have to be. Continuing onto another front, another aspect of controversy during the wartime was what to do about fighting Japan. Now, after Pearl Harbor, Japan took over much of Southeast and East Asia. The United States then implemented what was called an island hopping campaign. We started at the Battle of Midway, and we basically started taking islands closer and closer to mainland Japan. The Battle of Midway was largely considered a turning point battle in the Pacific theater of the war because it allowed us a base to have to launch future campaigns against areas closer and closer to Japan. However, the Japanese military strategy and the military values of the Japanese people are very different than what Americans and Westerners in general are used to. Japan comes from a long tradition of honor, and part of that dates even back to the Bushido Code. And a samurai warrior operating in feudal Japan would take his life rather than surrender to the enemy, and that was considered the honorable thing to do. So that would explain why the Japanese were particularly brutal to their enemies, to their POWs. Any POW, any prisoner of war that was captured, was treated horrifically. The Japanese had some of the worst forms of torture imaginable, and that was largely because they had absolutely no respect for you if you were captured. If you allowed yourself to be captured, you were filth to them, because a respectable soldier would have taken his life beforehand, which is why you see the stories coming out of POW camps that were particularly harsh forms of torture and disrespect there. It also explains the existence of kamikaze pilots, Japanese young men who were willing to give their lives on suicide missions, on suicide bombing missions, to support the cause for the war. Essentially, in the Japanese ethic at the time, the nation was more important than your individual life. And on the island of Okinawa, the Japanese soldiers fought, many of which ended up committing suicide, but they even had the citizens on Okinawa, the civilians, commit suicide as well, rather than being taken over by a invading force. So all of this really signals that the Japanese are willing to fight to the death. They do not care about their own individual lives. They will keep on fighting even if they are fighting a losing battle over and over and over again. And this is really what is going to foreshadow the need for something that is completely overwhelming, a way to really shock the Japanese into surrender, and that's going to be the atomic bomb. Here is a map of our engagements in the Pacific. You see in the blue lines the Allied advances, and you can see us hopping from island to island here. Within this red line, this encompasses everything that Japan tried to, or did, take over. It was even going to try to take over parts of Australia as well. And then the two atomic bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th in 1945. This is a picture of the Bataan Death March, and I've kind of already alluded to this previously. The Geneva Conventions were a series of conventions and agreements that happened after World War I, in which we, the signatories of the Geneva Conventions, ensured that prisoners of war would be treated humanely. Japan signed on to the Geneva Conventions as a major world power at the time, and basically they set down the rules of war. But what you're going to see in the Pacific theater is that Japan is going to violate a lot of these rules of war. American POWs are going to suffer brutal treatment at the hands of the Japanese, especially after the surrender of the Philippines. And, you know, as we've talked about, this goes back to the ethic of suicide rather than surrender. And so the Bataan Death March specifically was a march of American POWs and other POWs that were marched on a long journey between across the Philippines. Many of these POWs were forced to work in very grueling conditions. Many did not survive the camps, and many, and those that did, you know, obviously had lingering mental and emotional scars from that. Of course, this was before PSD was really a thing. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't recognized as a legitimate mental illness. So a lot of Americans came home from the war messed up, but there was no help for them, unfortunately. The war in the Pacific will continue several months after Germany surrendered. Germany surrendered in April of 1945. But as I've talked about, Japan is not very quick to surrender. During the war, the Manhattan Project had been operating clandestinely. Now, as I previously mentioned, it was employing thousands of American citizens, but most people working on this project didn't know exactly what they were doing. Only a few at the top knew. And this started largely because there were rumors that Germany had been trying to create an atomic bomb using nuclear fusion techniques. So Einstein and some other scientists wrote a letter to FDR saying that he needed to get on board with this and get on board with the idea of using nuclear technology in weapons of warfare, because if he didn't, we would surely become a target. Many of the original scientists that proposed the Manhattan Project didn't actually want us to use an atomic bomb. They just wanted us to have one so that no other power would attack us. It's essentially a form of protection. So the Manhattan Project begins, and it employs thousands of men and women at several different sites across the United States, and these are very secretive sites. Only a few actually know what the end result of this project is. Only a few know how deadly. Most people don't know that they're even developing a weapon. And only a few know exactly how deadly this weapon is. The first test is run in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the site of one of the Manhattan Project work sites. And the first successful test is there on July 16th, 1945. At this point, Harry Truman has taken over as President of the United States. In fact, the Manhattan Project was so secretive that Truman didn't even know about it until he became the president. He meets with other world leaders at Potsdam in Europe and basically calls on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face utter destruction. Japan does not know what that utter destruction means. It does not respond to Harry Truman's decree with an unconditional surrender. Thus, on August 6th, the United States drops the first bomb on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, on August 9th, we drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. Both of these are places where there are military bases that we particularly want to take out. They are not heavy population centers, although many Japanese will be killed, and many will have long-term health issues as a result. Japan will surrender a few days later. This is known as VJ Day. This surrender will be received by General MacArthur, one of the main generals in the Pacific Theater, and General MacArthur then will take over the rebuilding efforts in Japan. The Emperor of Japan will be allowed to remain as a figurehead, but basically the United States government will go in at this time and help Japan to write a constitution. We will take out the Japanese, we will get rid of the Japanese military, so even to this day, Japan does not have really a standing army. They have a very small self-defense force, but we essentially constitute their main defensive forces. I'm going to skip over that. So, I'm just going to read this to you. The United States and its allies achieved victory over the Axis powers through a combination of factors, including allied political and military cooperation, industrial production, technological and scientific advances, and a popular commitment to advancing democratic ideals. So this kind of summarizes how we as a nation were able to be victorious. It was considered a total war. Everybody pulled together in this war effort. Everybody made sacrifices. And in the end, Allied victory will commence. Some of the factors leading to Allied victory, and we're going to kind of jump back a little bit here, and we're going to talk about some of the diplomacy that took place during the war. The first of which was the Atlantic Charter. This happened on August 14th, 1941. Now you'll notice that this is before the United States actually enters the war. We don't enter the war until December. But the Atlantic Charter was an agreement that was signed on a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, which is why it was called the Atlantic Charter. Churchill and FDR agreed to work together to promote peace after the war, and FDR convinces Churchill to agree to give up some of the British colonies to put an end to colonialism after the war. They also at this time espoused the four freedoms: the freedom of speech and religion, and the freedom from want and freedom from fear. So this is very similar to Wilson before World War I. Really, his slogan was the idea of making the world safe for democracy. This is kind of what they're saying once again. We want to make the world safe for democracy. During the war, there were a series of wartime conferences among the Allied powers. The first of which, January 1943, was the Casablanca Conference. And this was where the Allied powers were the for the first time demanded the unconditional surrender of the Axis. This basically means that Germany, Italy, and Japan, if they want to surrender, it needs to be a complete surrender. There cannot be any conditions or anything that they hold back from that. The Tehran Conference in November of 1943 was more of a strategic planning conference in which the Allied forces agreed to focus on liberating France, and that's after that the plans for the D-Day invasion will be put into works. In Yalta, February 1945, the Allied powers are going to be making the long-term plans for after the war. And this is what's really going to set up the Cold War here. It's the Yalta Conference. Essentially, the powers agreed to divide Germany. So Russia will, or the USSR at the time, will get half of Germany, will get the eastern portion of Germany, and the Allied powers will control the western portion of Germany. The USSR does promise that the nations of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, all those guys, promises that they will get free elections. They also promise that once they finish waging the war in Europe, and by February of 1945, the war in Europe is winding down, it becomes pretty clear that Germany is going to have to surrender soon. The Soviets promised that once Germany surrenders, once they are done waging the war in Europe, they will enter the war against Japan. They also are given control of a disputed island chain, and they are promised rights in Manchuria, which is that northern region of China that Japan had invaded previously. And Yalta is also where the world powers agree to a new world peace organization. Now, one of the other factors that many say that played a role in us dropping the bomb when we did on Japan was this agreement here that the Soviets would enter the war against Japan. This was seen as problematic for a lot of Americans. We didn't actually want them to enter the war against Japan because we knew that if they helped us defeat Japan, we would have to divide Japan after the war, much like we divided Germany. And we didn't really want to do that. We wanted to take control of rebuilding Japan. We got to take control of rebuilding half of Germany, but as you hopefully remember from last year, Germany will remain divided up until the 1990s, and it is a fairly problematic situation. So by dropping the bombs when we did, we were able to end the war before the Soviets could get involved. President Roosevelt returns from Yalta, and he dies of various health causes. Truman, his vice president, takes control, and Truman will be present at the Potsdam Conference. This is, once again, where Japan is warned to surrender unconditionally, and Potsdam also sets the stage for a series of war crimes trials, also known as the Nuremberg trials, which will be held after the war to convict the Nazis. Some of the other aspects of the contributing to the Allied victory, so besides the diplomacy during the war, you have some new technology being created. The development of sonar was one very significant technological development, and this was developed largely to detect and potentially sink German U-boats. This uses sound waves to vibrate off an object and tell us just how far an approaching object is. And this also, sonar was developed in collaboration with a lot of British engineers. The British had also developed radar, which does the same thing in the air. It helps you, and that's one of the reasons why the British were able to effectively counter the German air attacks, or the German blitzkrieg of London, because they had effective or developing radar systems that enabled them to take down approaching planes. We've already talked about the Manhattan Project quite a bit, but obviously a very, very significant technological aspect of World War II was the Manhattan Project. As I said, this was a response to the discovery that German scientists were working to build an atomic bomb. After Einstein and some of his colleagues wrote a letter to FDR, the United States government authorizes funding for the project to develop the atomic bomb. Einstein will regret writing that letter after the war. He comes out to say he never intended the loss of life that the atomic bomb incurred. He never intended the Cold War to be initiated because of it. But regardless, the United States was able to very successfully create this device, which did ultimately put an end to the war. The top scientists from around the world were recruited. Einstein himself did not work on the bomb. He was not allowed. He was actually seen as a security threat. 3 research facilities employed over 120,000 Americans, so of course that's a lot of people to keep silent, but if you don't know exactly what you're working on and you only have one small piece of the project, it's a lot easier. You see, this is another picture of women working in war industries, and these are some women working at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And what the Oak Ridge plant did was it tried to essentially separate atoms to make unstable atoms. And I'm not going to get too much into the science of this because this is not my forte here, but essentially these machines were working on creating unstable atoms, and they had to monitor the machines. They had to keep the heat levels at a certain place, and they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know that they were actually working with atoms. They were just told, you know, adjust the dials so that the gauge is between this set of numbers, and make sure you keep it there all day long. Not a very exciting job, but for many women it was exciting. It was exciting to get a paycheck. It was exciting to be contributing to the war effort. And it was kind of cool, too, that they couldn't really talk about it. I mean, they knew they were doing something important because there were signs throughout the Oak Ridge plant to essentially not talk, to not say anything. You couldn't even talk to your fellow coworkers. If someone was working in a different building or a different department, you were not allowed to talk about work at all. And there actually were people who were kind of set up as spies to report anyone who was talking about what they did that day at work. So very, very secretive environment there. Long-term impacts, of course, strict secrecy, and this continues. Today, many people in this area, working in this area, have security clearances, and many of your parents may have security clearances. They can't talk about what goes on at work. So they would understand a little bit of what these employees at Oak Ridge were going through. About $2 billion in taxpayer money is spent to make the most deadly weapon in history. And this is kind of where I said last time, one of the debates that comes as a result of the Manhattan Project is this loss of accountability. As the government becomes more secretive, we don't know exactly where our tax money is going. And many people had problems with this. Many, such as Einstein and many others, had problems with the fact that the United States used so much of our taxpayer money to kill people, to kill civilians so drastically. This will initiate the start of what's called big science, and this is a term that refers to the government contracts going to expensive research and development programs. And today, a lot of the major scientific developments that we have in this country are coming from government-sponsored projects. So very relevant still, an industry that really fuels us here in Northern Virginia. So, it's definitely a complex and somewhat controversial industry, but we definitely benefit from it every day, living where we do, and the economy that we've been able to maintain here in Nova. Let's see. This last slide here is. Oh, I guess it's not the last slide, sorry. This just shows, this is one of the famous pictures that was taken at the end of the war on VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And basically, the idea is, we, the American government, emerged dominant. We pretty much ran the post-war peace settlements. We ensured that Asia and Europe would be rebuilt. We tried to prevent a lot of the negative things that happened at the end of World War I. There were no reparations. We did not try to humiliate the Axis powers. Yes, they did have, our armies did stay there for a while and try to rebuild, but the idea was to create a more democratic world, and the reason our armies stayed and helped with that effort was to create that. And we will emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. Why was the U.S. so quick to take the lead in establishing the United Nations this time around? Well, hopefully if you were paying attention at all the last few weeks, you know the answer to that. We clearly knew that leadership was needed in an international organization if it was to be successful. The League of Nations was not successful. The League of Nations did virtually nothing to prevent World War II, and we were hoping to take the lead and prevent some of the problems from reoccurring. We even offered a site for the United Nations in New York City, and you can go visit that today. Some of the costs of the war. Excluding the Civil War, Americans' death toll, so if we take out the Civil War, our death toll in the World War II was higher than in all other U.S. wars combined. Deficit spending was also very high. We went into debt during the Great Depression. FDR, if you remember, got a lot of criticism for that. We went into even greater debt during the World War II. Most of this debt was in the form of bonds to American citizens that we will pay back after the war. However, it's not really as much of a crisis as you might think, because after World War II, even during and after World War II, American incomes are very high. Everybody's working. Virtually everyone is working. After World War II, you're going to see a lot of women leaving the workforce, but you're going to be able to pay off that deficit more easily because the economy will be strong and people will be paying their taxes, and those taxes will pay off that deficit. So overall, the U.S. is going to be launched into yet another period of prosperity. This period of prosperity is going to continue. And one of the reasons that this new prosperity will continue, it's not going to be short-lived like the 1920s, that is because of our focus on the defense industry and the fact that defense contracting will continue. So we're going to see a lot of parts of the South opening up and industrializing and continuing to build weapons and advanced technology as we become a part of the Cold War. How are people viewing the future? Well, rather optimistically, actually. Many Americans view the outcome of World War II as being handled a lot better than World War I. So we have sort of, rather than trying to flee and ignore the world, America finally steps up. America finally takes responsibility, becomes a world leader. And so at this point, you are going to see the United States becoming pretty much top dog internationally. However, we're very soon going to be joined by the USSR, and that will initiate the Cold War, which we will get into in the next unit, in Unit 8 after the test. All right? So, thank you so much for listening, and I hope this was beneficial to you.